My name is Andy Ward, and today I'm going to be answering the web's most searched for questions about ancient pottery. Why was ancient pottery important? Well, it was important at the time when it was being made and used because it filled an important role in their society. It could be ceremonial, it could be that they were using it to store or carry water, or to keep rodents out of food. So it was important to them at the time. That's why they went through the effort to make it. Ancient pottery is important to us today because it can help teach us about how people lived and worked back in those times. And it's also important pieces of art that are invaluable to our society. How did they make pottery in ancient times? Well, it depends a lot on the culture. So in some places like Mesopotamia, they were using the pottery wheel thousands of years ago. Whereas here where I live in Arizona, they didn't use the pottery wheel until relatively recently. So here, ancient pottery was made using the coil and scrape method and with the paddle and anvil method. Other places it was formed using slabs or pinch pots or wheels, so it depends a lot on the culture where you live. How to date ancient pottery? Sometimes pottery can be hard to date. You can date pieces of wood using tree ring dating or dendrochronology, or you can date pieces of wood or organic material using radiocarbon dating, but ceramics can be a little more complicated. So a lot of times if you find pottery next to some pieces of wood that can be tree ring dated, then you can assume that the pottery was from that period of time. And then once you have established a date line for a certain type of pottery, let's say this type of pottery we always find with pieces of wood from this date, then when we find those pieces of pottery in other sites where there isn't any good tree ring dates or radiocarbon dates, we can still kind of suggest what time period that pottery is from. How was ancient pottery fired? Well, it depends again on the culture that you're talking about. So if we go back to like ancient Japan or China, we might find they were using kilns to fire their pottery thousands of years ago. Here in the Southwest where I live, it was more fired in like an open fire, more like a campfire sort of situation, or up around the Four Corners they were using something called a trench kiln where they were burying it down in the ground. So it just depends a lot on the culture. Here in my area in the Southwest, they weren't using traditional kilns so much. Down in Mexico, maybe 1,000 miles south of here, they did have actual kilns. And over in the old world, of course, they had kilns real early on. How to identify ancient pottery? Archaeologists look at a lot of different things to help identify and to label ancient pottery. They might look at what they call the paste, which is the clay body on the inside of the pot. They might look at the temper that is used inside that clay body to identify the pottery. And then they also look at the way it was made and decorated, different kinds of clay slips or minerals, and the way it was formed. Coil and scrape versus paddle and anvil, for example, might help an archaeologist identify what kind of pottery they're looking at. How to authenticate ancient pottery? This is an interesting question. So this again would depend on the culture that you were looking at. So I'm an expert on pottery from southeastern Arizona, but if you brought me like a vase from China, I would have no idea what to tell you about it, right? Or if you brought me a pot from Mesopotamia, I couldn't tell you anything about it or even tell you if it was real. So you would need to find an expert on the culture from which that pottery came. You might find one of those experts at a local museum or at a shop that specializes in selling antiquities of that type. Why is ancient pottery a magnetic time capsule? So when the clay is heated up in the firing process, it all becomes kind of fluid. And all the little iron particles in the clay, all clay naturally has some iron in it, all those little iron particles will align themselves with magnetic north. And then when the pottery cools, those iron particles are locked into that place. So you'll find that a pot, all the iron particles are pointing in the same direction. With a fire hearth in a house, they can actually use those iron particles to tell when that hearth was last fired, because magnetic north moves around. And so then they can figure out what direction those particles are pointing and help them to understand when that pit was last fired. A pot doesn't work the same way because once you move it, there's no way to know exactly where it was when it was fired. But we can still learn from those iron particles, like they can learn exactly how strong the Earth's magnetic field was when that pottery was fired, because those iron particles in the clay are locked into that position that they were put in when the pot was fired. What is ancient pottery? Ancient pottery is just pottery that's very old. So ancient just means in the distant past, and pottery, of course, is clay that has been fired to ceramic. So it's just old pottery. Any pottery that is more than maybe 100 or 200 years old can be referred to as ancient pottery. What is ancient pottery called? So archaeologists put pottery into little compartments. They like to break those up into smaller and smaller compartments. That helps them study the pottery and understand when and how it was made. So for example, they might talk in broad categories, like they might say Holcomb buffware, and that covers a broad category of pottery. But then they might talk about Gila Butte red on buff. That's a very specific type of pottery. And they're categorized based on the types of paint and the types of clay and the types of temper and how it's fired and these kinds of things. The same goes with Salado polychrome. That's a broad category. Within that you might have Dinwiddie polychrome and Gila polychrome and 9-mile polychrome, which are very specific, breaking down how it was painted or how it was fired and these sorts of things. And so these ancient potteries are called many different things based on how they were made. What was ancient pottery used for? Ancient pottery was used for all sorts of things. Sometimes it wasn't used at all. Sometimes it was decorative. Sometimes it filled some sort of ceremonial role. Sometimes it was used to store foods. Sometimes it was used for cooking or eating out of. It just had a million different uses. What is polychrome pottery? So pottery that's painted with only one color, so it has the background color, which could be the body clay or a slip that's painted over that, and then some sort of paint. So it has two colors that are visible on the pot. We call those bichrome, two colors, bichrome. Polychrome means more than two colors, three or more colors of decoration on the pot. So you have the background color, which, like I said, could be the body clay, could be a slip that's painted over that, and then you have a couple colors of decoration. It could be two different colors of paint, or it could be a paint and a slip. At any rate, you have three or more colors of decoration on the pot, makes polychrome. Poly for multiple, chrome for color. Where is the ancient pottery? Ancient pottery can be found in many different places. A lot of it is in the ground at archaeological sites and hasn't been disturbed. Some of it is in private collections, and a lot of it is in museums. The best place for you to probably find ancient pottery in your area is to go to an archaeological or historical museum to see what ancient pottery they have. What can we learn from the decorations on ancient pottery? Well, for one thing, we can look at the decorations to learn about how these people lived. We can learn what kind of materials they had access to and how they were applying those materials. Just a scientific study of the decorations alone can teach us a lot about how life was back then. But the decorations can also teach us about what they were thinking and what they believed in. They may show scenes from mythology or scenes that have to do with their religious beliefs, their agricultural life. It teaches us a lot about their life just by looking at the designs and what those mean. When was ancient pottery invented? And that again depends a lot on what part of the world you're in and what culture we're talking about. Here where I live in Tucson, pottery didn't begin to be made and used regularly until about 200 AD. But if we go to the old world, like Mesopotamia, we find pottery thousands of years ago. I think some of the oldest pottery in the world is found in Japan, where they have pottery that dates thousands and thousands of years ago. So it just really depends a lot on where you live. If you want to learn more about ancient pottery, check out this video right over here. Catch you next time.